I want to start by saying I'm not someone who scares easily. I've spent the better part of 15 years doing backcountry hiking alone, and I've had my share of close calls with wildlife. Black bears twice, a moose once that I would have preferred not to meet, and more than a few nights where the weather turned on me in a way that could have gone badly. None of that prepared me for what happened on the Gorge Trail in northern Pennsylvania in the fall of 2019. A little context first. I'm a high school geography teacher. I spend my summers and long weekends in the backcountry whenever I can manage it. My ex-wife used to say I was more comfortable with a topo map than a restaurant menu, which wasn't entirely wrong. The point is, I know the outdoors, I know how to read terrain, how to read weather, and I know the difference between regular animal behavior and something that's off. That matters, because what I saw out there was off. Profoundly, deeply off in a way I still haven't been able to reconcile. It was the second weekend of October, peak leaf season, which meant the lower trails were packed, which was exactly why I'd chosen the route I was on. The Gorge Trail runs along a narrow creek bed, about 4 miles in from the nearest trailhead, and beyond the first junction, you almost never see other hikers. The elevation gain is steep enough to filter out most casual walkers, and honestly, the terrain down in the gorge itself is a little punishing. Loose shale, scrambling, long stretches, where you're hopping from rock to rock along the creek. I'd done the route twice before without incident. Beautiful area, dramatic cliffs, cold, clear water, that particular kind of silence you only get when the geography swallows up the ambient noise of the world. I went in Friday afternoon, made camp at the flat area just past the second river crossing, and had a genuinely perfect evening. Good fire, clear sky, the kind of night where you feel embarrassingly grateful to be alive. Saturday I did a long day loop that took me all the way up to the ridge before dropping back down the other side of the gorge. About 14 miles total. Came back to camp exhausted in the best way. Ate, read for a bit by headlamp, and was asleep by 9. Sunday morning was when it started. I woke up around 5:30, still dark out, and immediately knew something was wrong. I've woken up in the backcountry hundreds of times, and there's a specific quality to mornings out there. The birds start before first light. Small things rustle. The creek makes its noise. The soundscape is busy and layered in a way that becomes comfortable once you're used to it. That Sunday morning it was completely silent. Not quiet. Silent. The kind of silence that has a weight to it, if that makes sense. Like something had been turned off. I lay there in my sleeping bag for probably 5 minutes just listening. Nothing. Not the creek. Not the birds. Not the wind. I told myself it was probably just the weather changing. Pressure drops can do strange things. Animals go quiet before a storm. I checked my weather app, which I still had a bar of signal for, and it showed nothing unusual. Clear through the afternoon, I packed up camp and started heading back toward the trailhead. My plan was to be out by midday, grab lunch somewhere on the drive home, standard end of trip routine. The first thing that made me slow down was the smell. About a mile into my hike out, I came around a long bend in the creek and hit a wall of it. The only way I can describe it is like something between a dead animal and a wet dog, but sharper. Muskier. I've smelled decomposition before, and it wasn't quite that. It was more like a living smell, if that makes any sense. An animal smell. Something large, but with a top note I couldn't place, and still can't. I stopped walking and just stood there trying to figure out where it was coming from. The gorge at that section is maybe 40 meters wide, with rock walls rising maybe 60, 70 feet on either side. Dense hemlock up top, some birch. The creek runs through the middle. I scanned the walls, scanned the tree line, saw nothing. The smell was strong enough that I actually pulled my bandana up over my face for a bit, which felt ridiculous, but I did it anyway. I kept moving. About 20 minutes later, I heard it for the first time. It was a sound that I initially interpreted as rockfall, a sharp cracking, then a sustained low rumble, then silence. It came from the top of the gorge wall to my right, maybe 100 meters ahead of me. I stopped and watched the rim, expecting to see a chunk of shale tumbling down. Nothing came. After 30 seconds or so, I started walking again, and that's when I heard the second sound. This one I cannot explain away as rockfall or settling terrain or anything else. It was a vocalization, a low, resonant, almost grinding sound, like someone dragging furniture across a concrete floor, except it was rhythmic. It lasted maybe 4 seconds, stopped, then repeated twice more with a pause in between each time. I've heard recordings of mountain lions since then, trying to match it up. Not even close. This was lower in pitch and less tonal, more mechanical sounding. I've heard people suggest it was a raven doing a weird call. Ravens do make surprisingly strange sounds, but they're not that loud, and they don't produce anything in that frequency range. I stopped walking again. I don't know exactly what instinct was at play, but I had a very strong feeling that I should not move, not run, not call out, not make any sudden movements. I just stood there in the middle of the creek bed with my poles planted and tried to control my breathing and figure out where the sound was coming from. It had definitely come from the top of the gorge wall, same general area as the rockfall sound. But I couldn't see anything up there except trees. Then something moved. At first I thought it was a tree. There was a tall, pale birch near the rim of the gorge, one of several, and I thought the wind had caught it, except there was no wind. And then I watched the birch move again, and I realized with a slow, horrible certainty that it wasn't moving the way trees move. It was moving with intention. Lateral movement, not the swaying of branches. A step. I'm a geography teacher. I know what a birch tree looks like. I know that birch trees do not step. What I was looking at, and I had a good clear line of sight for maybe 30 seconds before the angle changed, was something roughly the height and pale coloring of a birch tree, but moving along the rim of the gorge with a deliberate, unhurried gait. Long limbs, a torso I couldn't make sense of. It was moving parallel to the gorge, which meant it was moving in the same direction I was going, which meant it was, at that moment, moving toward the trailhead. I did not run. I made a decision that I still think was the right one, which was to give it time and distance. I stood exactly where I was for what felt like a very long time, maybe 10 minutes, watching the rim until I was certain nothing was moving up there anymore. Then I walked. Not jogged, not sprinted. Walked with purpose, making as little noise as I could, watching the rim every few seconds. The smell intensified twice more before it faded, both times right before the rim came back into my sight line after a blind bend. I don't want to read too much into that, but I don't know what else to make of it. I got out of the gorge without seeing it again. Here's the part that has bothered me most since then. When I reached the trailhead and walked to my car, I passed the information board at the entrance. There's a standard display, trail maps, wildlife advisory, leave no trace stuff. Someone had taped a laminated printout to the board that hadn't been there Friday when I went in. It was a simple black and white flyer, no official Park Service markings, that said something along the lines of, trail users have reported unusual activity in the gorge section. Use caution. Do not approach wildlife. No organization listed. No contact information. No date. I stood there reading it for probably 2 full minutes trying to understand what I was looking at. Then I took a photo of it. I've since sent that photo to the county parks department, asking if they put it up, or if they knew who did. They replied that they had no record of it, and that the board is only supposed to display officially sanctioned materials. I've been back to the trailhead twice since then. The flyer was gone the first time. The board had been restocked with fresh official materials. The second visit, everything was normal. I don't know what I saw up on that rim. I've sat with the bare explanation, the pale bark of a dead tree that I mistook for movement, a trick of light in a gorge where the angles do strange things. I've run through all of it. The problem is that the movement was sustained and directional. It went from one point to another point along the rim in a way that covered a significant distance. No static object moves like that. What I keep coming back to is how unbothered it seemed. It wasn't startled by me. It wasn't fleeing. It was just moving along the top of that gorge at its own pace like it had somewhere to be. I've hiked the region 3 times since, and I haven't gone back to the gorge. I don't know that I will. Not because I'm afraid exactly. More because there's a kind of encounter where your gut tells you that you got away with something, that the outcome could have been very different, and the smart move is to respect that and stay away. Whatever was up on that rim, the silence that morning was not a coincidence. The animals in that gorge knew something was there before I did. They always know, first. The thing that still messes with me isn't what I saw. It's that it was watching us for 2 days before we knew it was there. My brother Danny and I do a fishing trip every September without fail. We've done it since we were teenagers, back when our dad used to take us, and we kept the tradition going after he passed. Same general area every year, a stretch of backcountry lake country in northern Ontario, about 3 hours past the last town with a gas station. You access it by canoe, portaging between lakes, and by the second portage, you're genuinely in the middle of nowhere. No cell signal, no other people, no noise except water and wind and whatever's in the trees. We'd been going to the same chain of lakes for 6 years running. We knew the campsite, knew where the pike liked to hold in the morning, knew every portage trail well enough to do it half asleep with a loaded canoe on our shoulders. It was our place, comfortable and familiar. That September, Danny brought his friend Joel along for the first time. Joel was a good guy, outdoorsy enough, and it was Danny's trip as much as mine, so I was fine with it. 3 is actually a better number for canoe camping in some ways. You can run a 2-man and a solo, or pack 1 canoe heavier and take turns. We paddled in on a Friday afternoon and made camp on the big flat granite shelf we always used at the north end of the second lake. Friday night was perfect. Fire, whiskey, fish fry, the whole thing. Joel fit right in, didn't complain about anything, pulled his weight. I thought it was going to be a great trip. Saturday morning was when I noticed the other campfire. We were having coffee before dawn, before Danny and Joel had even crawled out of their tents, and I was sitting facing south across the lake. The lake is maybe a kilometer wide at that point, heavily wooded on all sides, and on the far shore, directly across from us, there was the faint orange glow of a fire. I sat with it for a while. It wasn't unusual for other parties to be on the lake. The route is popular enough, especially in September. I mentioned it to Danny when he came out and he looked across, shrugged, said probably just another group of guys doing the same thing we were. We didn't think anything more of it. Saturday was a good day. We fished the morning, made a lot of miles in the afternoon, cooked a big meal at dusk. I probably looked across the lake 4 or 5 times throughout the day, half out of habit. The far shore was heavily shadowed, and I couldn't make out any tent or camp structure. But the fire came back at dusk. Same spot. Low, orange, steady. That night around 11, Danny and Joel had gone to bed, and I was doing my usual last man up routine, banking the fire, putting food in the bear hang, that kind of thing. The lake was absolutely still, no wind at all, the kind of night where it looks like the stars are sitting on the water. I looked across to the far shore, and the other fire was still going. Here's the thing. A campfire that's still burning at 11 at night is normal, but a campfire that looks exactly the same at 11 at night as it did at 6 in the morning is not. The size, the color, the steadiness of it, it hadn't changed in 17 hours. A real fire changes. It grows when you feed it, dies down when you don't, shifts with the wind. This thing had been the same unwavering orange glow all day long. I told myself I was overthinking it, that I'd simply not been looking closely enough during the day to notice variations. I went to bed. Sunday morning it was still there. I didn't say anything to Danny or Joel right away. I just watched it while I made the coffee. Steady glow, same location, same intensity. I got out our binoculars and glassed the far shore properly for the first time. I could see the glow, but I could not see a fire. There was no column of smoke, no flickering. The light seemed to come from ground level, low in the trees, and it was more consistent than any fire I've ever looked at. Almost like an ember, but brighter and more orange. And there was no camp that I could see. No tents, no canoes, no gear on the shore. I showed Danny. He looked for a while without saying anything, and then put the binoculars down. Could be a tent with a light inside, he said, or a lantern. Maybe. Except it had been there since before we arrived Friday. We'd paddled in mid-afternoon, and it was there then, I realized, trying to replay the paddle in, that low orange point on the far shore. I'd registered it without really noting it, the way you process background detail you're not focused on. But it had been there, and if someone had set up camp across the lake, before us, and was still there Sunday morning, they hadn't moved in at least 2.5 days. Joel was the one who suggested we paddle over and check it out. I didn't want to. I want to be honest about that. There was something about the consistency of that glow that felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate, and my gut was telling me to leave it alone. But I also couldn't come up with a solid reason not to go, and Danny seemed curious, and the two of them were already carrying the canoe to the water by the time I finished my coffee. It took about 20 minutes to paddle across. The lake was calm, and we covered the distance without much effort. As we got closer, I kept my eyes on the far shore, and the glow remained visible all the way to about 50 meters out, and then it was just gone. Not dimmed, gone, like someone had turned off a switch. We landed on a narrow strip of rocky beach and pulled the canoe up. Joel jumped out and immediately started looking around, and Danny and I followed. There was nothing there. No fire pit, no fire ring, no scorched ground, no tents, no gear, no food, no trace of any human presence at all. The tree line started maybe 10 meters from the water, and it was dense, old spruce, thick undergrowth, dark even in the morning light. We walked the shoreline in both directions for a couple 100 meters each way. Nothing. Danny said, "Reflection, maybe. Sun on the rock face." He pointed to a section of granite bluff further down the shore. I looked at the bluff. Then I looked at where the bluff was relative to where we'd seen the glow. The angles didn't work. The glow had come from ground level in the trees, not from a rock face, and it had been there at night when there was no sun to reflect. We paddled back. I didn't sleep well Sunday night. I kept waking up and looking out the mesh of my tent toward the far shore. The glow was there each time I looked. Around 3 in the morning, I unzipped my tent, sat outside in the cold, and watched it for a long time. It didn't move. It didn't change. It just sat there in the dark trees on the opposite shore, orange and patient. And then I had a thought that I genuinely wish hadn't occurred to me, because once it did, I couldn't unthink it. If something wanted to watch a campsite from a safe distance, without being identified as a threat, a low, steady light that you'd write off as another campfire would be a pretty effective way to do it. You'd look at it, decide it was just another group of campers, and stop paying attention to it. You'd never think to watch it back. We hadn't, for 2 full days. I told myself I was spiraling. I packed that thought away and went back to bed. Monday morning we broke camp. Standard pack out, everything stowed, canoe loaded. I did one last walk of the site to make sure we hadn't left anything. And that's when I found the track. It was at the edge of the campsite, in a narrow band of soft mud, where the granite shelf met the tree line. A single track, partial, like whatever made it, had only caught the soft ground with the ball of 1 foot, but it was enough to see the basic shape. It was broad and roughly human in outline, but with a spacing between the toes that didn't look right, and it was big. I wear a size 11 boot. This track was meaningfully larger than my boot, and I was wearing my boots when I found it. I held my foot next to it. I called Danny over. He looked at it for a while. Neither of us said anything. Joel took a photo. I don't know if he still has it. We paddled out. The glow was gone by the time we were halfway across the first portage, or at least I stopped checking for it. By the time we reached the cars, I'd mostly convinced myself there were rational explanations for most of it, except the track I couldn't logic away, and I haven't in the years since. I've looked up bear tracks, moose tracks, every large animal in northern Ontario. None of them match what I saw in that mud. We've been back to the lake twice since. I don't look across to the far shore at night anymore. Danny does, though. Old habit, I guess. Last September he woke me up at 2 in the morning, didn't say anything, just handed me the binoculars and pointed. I've never told anyone the full version of this. Not my wife, not my closest friends. Partly because I know how it sounds. Mostly because every time I've tried to tell it, I get to a certain part and I just can't finish. I'm going to try to finish it tonight. In the summer of 2016, I was doing a solo through hike on a long trail in the Cascade Mountains in Washington State. 5 days, 4 nights, roughly 60 miles of high alpine terrain. I'd done comparable trips before and I was fit, well equipped, and I knew the route. Day 1 and 2 were flawless. By the afternoon of day 3, I was deep in the backcountry, 8 or 9 miles from the nearest trailhead in any direction, moving through a long stretch of subalpine meadow that sits at about 6,000 feet. The trail in that section runs along the edge of a steep forested drop on the left, an open meadow on the right. You can see a long way in the meadow direction, rolling grass and wildflower, scattered boulder fields, the kind of landscape that makes you feel very exposed and very small. I remember thinking how much I loved that particular stretch. Open sky, easy grade, the kind of hiking that lets your mind go quiet. My mind went quiet all right. I'd been moving for about 20 minutes through that section when I saw the figure. It was standing in the meadow, maybe 300 meters to my right, completely still. My first thought was another hiker, and I raised a hand in the automatic greeting you give on trail. It didn't respond, didn't wave, didn't move, just stood there. I thought maybe they hadn't seen me, so I kept walking and glanced over again a minute later. Still there, still completely motionless. I slowed down and looked properly this time. The figure was tall, taller than it should have been for the distance. I'd been hiking long enough at that point to be reasonably good at gauging scale against terrain, and whatever was standing in that meadow was bigger than a person. Not dramatically, not monster movie big, but enough that it registered. Maybe 7 feet, maybe a little more. And it was the wrong shape. The proportions were off in a way that I kept trying to correct mentally, kept trying to reframe as a person with a large pack or unusual clothing. But the more I looked, the more wrong it got. The limbs were too long, the shoulders too wide and too flat. It was the color of dead grass. I told myself it was a stump. Stood there looking at a stump. I said out loud, laughing a little. Stumps don't stand in open meadow at 6,000 feet in the Cascades, a part of my brain pointed out. But I kept walking anyway, and I stopped looking at it for about 30 seconds. Then I looked back. It had moved. Not dramatically. It wasn't closer, wasn't charging at me, wasn't doing anything threatening. It had simply rotated. When I first saw it, it was side on to the trail. Now it was facing me, still completely motionless but oriented directly toward me, in a way that stumps, for all their faults, do not manage. I want to be precise about what I felt in that moment, because I think it matters. It wasn't the sharp fear of a sudden threat. It was something slower, and in some ways worse. A cold, creeping certainty that I had made a mistake by looking at it, that the correct move had been to keep my eyes on the trail and not look back, and by looking back I had done something I couldn't undo. I faced forward, and I walked, faster than before but not running. I told myself firmly and repeatedly that there was a rational explanation, that I was dehydrated and tired on day 3 of a solo hike, and my brain was pattern matching hard on an unusual rock formation or some quirk of terrain. I did not look back for a long time. When the trail curved left and the meadow dropped out of sight, I felt the tension in my shoulders release, and I almost laughed with relief. See, I told myself, nothing. I made camp 2 miles further on, at a small tarn just below the tree line, set up my tent, made food, went through the motions. The evening was beautiful, alpenglow on the peaks, the tarn going pink and then purple. I sat outside my tent longer than usual, not wanting to go in, which I only understand in retrospect. I woke up at 2 in the morning to the sound of something walking, not something small. The footfalls were heavy and slow and spaced far apart, coming from the tree line about 50 meters from my tent. I lay completely still in my sleeping bag, eyes open in the dark, and counted the steps. 7, 8, 9. Then they stopped. Total silence. I waited, maybe 2 minutes, maybe 5, and then they started again. Same pace, same weight, moving along the tree line, parallel to the tarn. I want to tell you I reached for bear spray and checked my tent zipper and handled it calmly. What I actually did was lie absolutely rigid and not move and barely breathe for what felt like an extremely long time. Eventually, the footsteps faded and I didn't hear them again. At some point, I fell back asleep from sheer exhaustion. In the morning, I found the tracks. They circled the tarn, all the way around it. I followed them for a while before I could make myself stop. Large bipedal impressions in the soft ground near the water's edge, uneven in depth, like whatever made them was favoring one side. They went around the tarn in a full loop that included 2 passes within 20 meters of my tent. The stride length between the prints was about 5 feet. I packed up faster than I have ever packed up anything in my life. I did the remaining 22 miles of trail in a day and a half, which is not a pace I'd recommend, and not one I'd managed before. I barely stopped, barely ate, barely looked at anything except the trail ahead of me. Every time the terrain opened up and I had wide sight lines, I would scan the meadows without fully wanting to, and then force my eyes back to the path. On the last afternoon, about 4 miles from the trailhead, I let myself relax for the first time. I'd been on the move for hours. The trail was busy with day hikers. I could see the valley below. I stopped and sat on a rock and drank some water and felt the knot in my chest loosen. That was when the smell hit me. The same smell from day 3, out in the meadow. That same dense animal musk, right there on a busy afternoon trail, with day hikers passing me, going in both directions. I stood up and looked around. Trees on both sides, other hikers ahead and behind, none of them reacting to anything unusual. I was the only one who could smell it. It lasted maybe 20 seconds, and then the breeze shifted, and it was gone. I have never hiked alone since. That's not a dramatic conclusion, not a lesson I decided to take from the experience. It's just what happened. Every time I've tried to plan a solo trip in the 3 years since, I get to the part where I'm standing at a trailhead alone with my pack, and something in me simply refuses to go. My wife thinks it's because I had a bad experience with weather. I told her that version years ago, and I've let her keep it because it's easier. I don't know how to tell her the real version without it sounding like I lost my mind out there. I didn't lose my mind. I know what I saw in that meadow. I know what walked around my tent. And I know with absolute certainty that on that last afternoon, 4 miles from safety, in broad daylight with people all around me, it was close enough to touch.